You feel a small itch on your scalp. You scratch it without thinking. You move on with your day. For almost all of human history, that itch was not a passing thing. It was a permanent resident. For roughly 300,000 years, your ancestors did not live alone inside their own bodies. They were walking ecosystems, crowds, each person a moving habitat for dozens of other living things. Worms in the gut, lice in the hair, flukes in the blood, tiny creatures that fed and bred and died inside a human being who never once knew they were there. Today, a dewormed, deloused, antibiotic-scrubbed modern human is one of the strangest organisms that has ever existed, almost completely alone on the inside. That is the historical exception, not the rule. So, how did your ancestors live with so many passengers? And why, for most of them, was it simply normal? Let's start with the evidence. Because the strange thing about parasites is that they leave a record. There is an entire science built around this. It is called paleoparasitology, the study of ancient parasites. And the people who built it spent their careers doing something most of us would refuse to do. They studied old waste. The technical word is coprolite. A coprolite is preserved feces, dried out in a desert cave or frozen, or buried in a way that stops it from rotting away. Crack one open under a microscope, and you do not just see dust. You see eggs, parasite eggs, thousands of years old, still perfectly shaped, still telling you exactly what was living inside the person who left them behind. In Brazil, a researcher named Adalto Araújo spent decades doing exactly this. Working at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, he and his colleague Luiz Fernando Ferreira pulled parasite eggs out of human remains that were thousands of years old. And what they found broke a piece of the human story wide open. They found hookworm in South America, in remains far older than it had any right to be. Here's why that matters. Hookworm is a parasite that burrows through the skin of your feet, travels through your body, and settles in your gut to drink your blood. But hookworm has a weakness. Its young cannot survive freezing ground. They need warm, moist soil to develop. For a long time, the textbook story said the first Americans walked in from Asia across a frozen land bridge during the Ice Age. But if those travelers crossed through that deep, bone-cracking cold, the hookworm inside them should have died on the way. Its life cycle simply cannot run in frozen dirt. So how did hookworm reach ancient Brazil? Araujo's worms became a quiet argument that the story was incomplete, that maybe people arrived earlier, or by warmer coastal routes, or in ways the old map never accounted for. A parasite egg, sealed in ancient waste, was forcing scientists to redraw the peopling of an entire hemisphere. That is the power of these passengers. They remember things we forgot. In the deserts of North America, another researcher, Carl Reinhard, turned coprolites into a kind of time machine. From dried human waste in caves like Heinz Cave in Texas, he could read what people ate, what made them sick, and which parasites they carried. Pinworm, tapeworm, thorny-headed worms picked up from eating insects. Each egg a tiny confession about a life lived 10,000 years ago. And the parasites did not only hide in the ground, sometimes they are still inside the body itself. You may have heard of Otzi, the Iceman, a man who died in the Alps around 5,300 years ago and froze so completely that his organs survived. When scientists studied what was left of his gut, including work by Piers Mitchell, a researcher at the University of Cambridge, they found the eggs of whipworm. Whipworm is a parasite that anchors itself into the wall of your large intestine and lives there, sometimes for years. Otzi was carrying it the day he died on that mountain. And it is not only the deep past. Mitchell also examined the remains of King Richard III of England, who died in battle in 1485. In the soil where his pelvis had been, they found roundworm eggs. A king of England, buried under what would one day become a parking lot, still carrying the same gutworm that troubled peasants in the fields. Rich or poor, ancient or medieval, the worms did not care. So let's reconstruct a day. Not a dramatic one, just an ordinary morning, tens of thousands of years ago. You wake on the ground. Your scalp itches before your eyes are even open, because lice have been busy in the night. You scratch the way you always do. You do not think of it as a problem. It is just the texture of being alive. Everyone around you scratches too. You walk barefoot to find water. The warm soil between your toes is alive with things too small to see, some of them waiting for skin to touch down. You drink. You eat what was caught and gathered, and with it, sometimes you swallow eggs you will never notice. Inside your gut, a slow, quiet population goes about its business. A few worms, maybe many. They take a little of your food, a little of your blood, a little of your iron. Usually not enough to kill you, just enough to ride along. This was not a horror story to your ancestors. This was Tuesday. And here's where it gets stranger than you would expect. Some of these passengers had been with the human family for an almost unimaginably long time. Pinworm, the small white worm that still infects children today, appears to have traveled with our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years, riding along through the entire human journey out of Africa and across the world. It was practically family. The tapeworm has an even stranger origin. You might assume humans got tapeworms from farming, from the cattle and pigs we domesticated. But the genetics tell a different story. Work led by the parasitologist Eric Hoberg traced human tapeworms back further than agriculture, suggesting our ancestors first picked them up on the African savanna, sharing kills and carcasses with the same lions and hyenas that hunted the same prey. We had tapeworms long before we had a single farm. Even your clothing has a parasite hidden in its history. There are two kinds of human lice that matter here: head lice, which live in your hair, and body lice, which live in the seams of clothing. Body lice can only exist if there are clothes for them to live in. So the geneticist Mark Stoneking and his colleagues had a clever idea. Date the body louse, and you date the invention of clothes. Their molecular clock pointed to something remarkable: that humans may have started wearing clothing more than 100,000 years ago, possibly as far back as 170,000. A parasite, by accident, became a clue to one of the most human inventions of all. Now for the twist. You would assume that getting rid of all these creatures was pure progress. Cleaner, healthier, better in every way. And in the obvious sense, it was. Hookworm anemia weakened millions. Some parasites blinded people, scarred organs, killed children. Losing them saved countless lives. That part is real. But the body that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years did not evolve to be empty. Your immune system grew up in a crowd. It spent the entire human story constantly negotiating with worms, tuning itself, calming itself, learning when to fight and when to stand down. Some scientists now suspect that when we suddenly removed every passenger in just a few short generations, that finely tuned system was left with nothing to do. And an immune system with nothing to fight does not simply go quiet. Sometimes it starts fighting the wrong things: pollen, peanuts, the body's own tissue, allergies, asthma, and certain autoimmune conditions, rare for most of human history, climb sharply in exactly the clean, deworming modern societies that got rid of the parasites first. This is the idea behind what some researchers call the old friends hypothesis. The unsettling possibility that a few of our lifelong passengers were not only enemies, that some of them were part of the deal, part of how a healthy human body learned to behave. It does not mean you should want worms. It means your body was built for company, and now it lives alone. So feel that small itch on your scalp again. Scratch it, without thinking. You are allowed to. The lice are gone. The worms are gone. The blood flukes and the gut-anchoring whipworm and the silent hookworm draining your iron, all gone, for most of you, swept out by clean water and modern medicine in a sliver of time so thin your ancestors would not recognize it. You are, by every historical measure, profoundly alone inside your own skin. And that, not the itch, not the worms, not the crowd of passengers your ancestors carried for 300,000 years, is the part that would have seemed truly strange to them.